material that I'm sharing with you deals with an esoteric school that I joined for a few years back in the late 70s, and which was at the time still an idealistic possibility for serious seekers. And in this recounting, I speak of that which we all shared in this extraordinary journey of discovery, of encounter with transformative knowledge, of great efforts made for those purposes. But it is necessary to reference the fact that 45 years later, the school still around has degenerated to a point of being essentially unrecognizable. And looking back, I realize that I was able to escape the monster's lair. And so in naming this recounting Dangerous Paths, I am looking back in hindsight at something that was corrupt from the beginning, and that joins that list of cults that littered the landscape of that era, and of which we still find ghoulish examples here and there. One of the great tragedies here is that even in the most sophisticated environment, with the best of human culture and thinking and Gurdjieff Uspensky teaching, there lurks the human capacity to degenerate into all the standard cultish behavior. For instance, the threat that if one leaves the school, one loses everything, loses contact with God, which is a supreme blasphemy, and yet repeated over and over again in a great variety of cults and religions. Even mainstream places, only here can you find cosmic universal truth and the lustful power, being given positions that transform people into little tyrants, enjoying now no longer their responsibility but their control over others. And that term power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, couldn't be more true. No platitude there. And how many leaders let their perversions take over, their hedonism be their only motivation, even with a surrounding of spiritual aura, and the trickery that is played upon their followers, the manipulations. It is a great disappointment to discover that it is the same old, regardless of the topic, the knowledge base, the elitism of the people involved. So what has become of this school in the nearly 5 decades since I left it is catastrophic and exposed, revealed, where once it was exceptionally secretive, unknown, unseen. And yet, strangely, despite that revelation of what is underneath it all, there's still no reckoning, no facing the consequences of the criminal abuse that has taken place, and especially the spiritual criminality of preying on people who hunger and thirst for meaning, for the sacred, for higher knowledge, for inner transformation and healing, and find the opposite, and in many cases total self-destruction. So this little sharing belongs to a particular moment in time when the naivete was still there, unable, unwilling, unprepared to face the darkness that lurks behind these glossy facades of spirituality for sale and veneration, idolatry of individuals who, it turns out, deserve handcuffs, not adulation. Therefore beware, always, and it is for this reason, as a warning, as an experience that I was blessed to survive, unscathed, that I send this out to those who can benefit from it. On my journey in search of meaning, I had the good fortune to come across a very special community. It was actually a school, an esoteric school, where people studied the teachings of G.I. Gurdjieff. The students came from all walks of life, all socioeconomic levels and educational backgrounds, a burning desire for inner development or spiritual awakening. Most of us had been seeking knowledge of a specific kind for years. Some had traveled as far as Tibet and India. There was a story of two students who became disciples of a Tibetan holy man, who after some time told them to go back to America to find a teaching that would give them enlightenment. He then gave them a latitude and a longitude that turned out to be the spot in Northern California where this school was founded. As with other such communities, our school had a teacher. This person was said to be a conscious being, that is, someone whose inner efforts had led him into higher levels of awareness. He was certainly different from most anyone you are likely to meet. His gaze pierced right to the marrow of one's being and left us helplessly exposed in all our imperfections. He was a man who radiated a strange blend of rare gentleness and inner strength. Most important of all, we were held together by the ideas of the Gurdjieff system, culled from ancient teachings and presented in incredibly pragmatic ways. These methods of inner transformation make possible genuine change. There was no question here of some vague faith in a spiritual promised land or future state of bliss. The work, as it is called, demands personal verification and provides the psychological tools for immediate application to one's attitudes. Members of this community made tremendous sacrifices. We lived in teaching houses where part of the instruction was to learn to put up with each other. There were weekly meetings and daily chores that forced the body to submit itself to one's higher aims. There were also demands for regular payments that were sometimes exorbitant. The money kept the community running, a community that had teaching houses in many cities and was becoming international. But we believed that the real reason for the financial pressure was aimed at ensuring an individual's commitment to the task of personal development. We didn't clearly understand that payment for the sake of spiritual results can never be an external activity. Real payment is internal effort against one's selfishness and pride. The money used in this kind of payment is made of effort and intentional suffering in order to break through toward a new level of understanding and behavior. Despite all these requirements, one might be surprised to know that the first 2 years in this environment were extraordinarily blissful. In this subculture disconnected from dull materialism and relentless advertising, we were given rare opportunities to rediscover our essential nature beneath the facades of personality. We learned to free ourselves from the unnecessary anger and irritation that poisoned so many lives. We marveled at the depth of the human potential as revealed by the best minds of civilized humanity: Pythagoras, Plato, Epictetus, Goethe, Blake, and many more. The purpose of this school was not only to lead us toward inner development, but also to gather and preserve the works created by the more illumined minds from all times and places. To live in such an environment in itself contributed to transformation. We were not merely gathered to study ideas of common interest. It was a matter of life and death for many of us. We were prepared to sacrifice everything, ambition, family, comfort, in order to find regenerating truth. Many of us were baby boomers who had survived the 60s or wandered the continents throughout the 70s and refused to become self-satisfied yuppies of the 80s and 90s. Becoming free of psychological baggage of the past and uncovering new vistas of understanding is worth all the money and electronic gadgets the world has to offer. Individually, we encountered that wonder toward life so important to the teachings of Socrates, that will so fundamental to all esoteric methods, and that universal goodness revealed at the heart of all religions. Here was a community of people in the process of being purified of their petty selfishness. Here were people with a new dignity and control over their irrational impulses and unpleasant manifestations. What could be better for the health and welfare of any community? A common goal, a common sacrifice, a common understanding. Surely these are the foundations of any long-lasting gathering of people. And yet certain very mundane conflicts began to surface among us. Who was closest to the teacher? Who had been around the longest? Who would give orders? The power inherent in the ideas had altered the course of our lives, but they were insufficient to overcome that all too familiar egotism. In analyzing this discrepancy between the knowledge of human transformation available to us and the increasingly absurd conflicts found in any group situation, I noticed the following factors. 1. The organization had become more important than the ideas that founded it. 2. The lifestyle of effort and sacrifice that we willingly entered into was now a dogmatic requirement rather than a personal commitment. 3. Students who had once searched for higher consciousness with pure motives were now satisfied with positions of authority within the little society they had created. 4. The teacher who was once at the center of activities now retired to a lofty, inaccessible position surrounded by a protective entourage. 5. The demands for money began to translate into luxurious possessions for the leadership rather than practical needs for the community. 6. The ideas themselves were reduced to learning by rote rather than used in dynamic application. A robot-like atmosphere was created as people offered memorized platitudes and imitated personalities rather than insights born from the furnace of intimate experience. Finally, I came to the conclusion that it was necessary for me to leave. If I was to think for myself, which the teaching insisted upon, then I had to follow my intuitions rather than the dictates of the group. It became increasingly difficult to put up with the concept that if one left the school, all was lost. So nearly 4 years after finding a family of fellow seekers, the like of which I had never hoped to discover, I left quietly to start again on my own. It was an experience as shattering as any divorce or loss of a loved one. But I soon learned that the best thing that had happened to me after joining that community was the act of leaving it. I discovered that when I paid the price to renounce my will for a higher purpose, and then paid an even greater one to take it back in order to be true to myself, a learning occurs that can be acquired in no other way and will always be a part of me. The community changed the course of my life. It introduced me to myself in a way that I could not have done on my own. It sustained me in making efforts that were sometimes beyond my natural capacity to endure. And it taught me to know when I had to listen to the inner master alone over anyone else, however apparently enlightened they may seem. We often assume that we already possess this power, but it is generally nothing more than the self-will that has dominated us since infancy. The process is the same in nearly all the great teachings of humanity, from the mystery schools of Egypt and Greece to modern esoteric organizations seeking higher consciousness. The inner journey is a cyclical spiral woven in a paradox. We lose ourselves in order to find ourselves. We join a community to develop our individuality. We leave the group to work for the good of that larger group named humanity.